Thank you very much. Today we're going to focus on that part of communication that's really, I believe, one of the most critical parts. It's called the defensive driving part. And it's a part relates to listening, which means if they're communicating and I'm not understanding, is it their fault or my fault if I'm the listener? Okay? If they're driving on the wrong side of the road and I'm driving on the right side of the road, I don't care whether I have an accident because it's going to be whose fault? Theirs. Well, you know better than that when it comes to driving. Unfortunately, we don't know better than that when it comes to listening. So we don't pre-qualify the listening. So if somebody walks down the hallway and says to us, gee, boy, I'd sure like to see you sometime tomorrow, and you say, great, and you walk on, you've been a lousy listener. Because when is tomorrow? You see what I'm saying? You have not pre-qualified what tomorrow means to have an agreement before you walk off. Somebody says, you know, I really need that project done this week. And you say, great, I'll get it done this week. As far as I'm concerned, you have not been defensive driving. Because when is this week? Is that before you have to leave on Friday at 5? Okay? Is that Friday morning? You have not defensively listened in that process. Somebody brings you in and evaluating your skills, and they're saying, you know, you could really be better at this. And you say, well, I'll work on it. Well, as far as I'm concerned, you're not a defensive listener, because what does better mean? You see what I'm saying? You have not quantified and qualified what better means, so you have no agreement in the communication process. And if you're arguing with a spouse, which I know none of you ever do, or a significant other, somebody's important in your life, and you're arguing, I guarantee in most arguments it goes back to a bad experience that happened years ago that seems to come up every time we have an argument. Okay? But you keep letting it come up to the point where you have no communication going on at all. Well, that's as much the listener's fault as it is the communicator's fault. Because if you have something that's reoccurring, and as a listener, you're not quantifying how to eliminate that frustration, then you're not being a defensive listener in the process. So let's take a little closer look at what this listening means. I really believe that listening has 3 levels. On page number 1, let's look at the 3 levels of listening. Number 1 level, or the first level, is hear listening. It's basically defined as, I knew something was said. I have a general idea of what it was. Hear listening. Number 2 level is listen listening. So in other words, I can repeat the words, and I might be able to give you a little bit of the intent. You know, they said I did a great job, you know, and I know what that means. And that's what they said, you did a great job. So that's listen listening. The 3rd level is think listening. Think listening requires process listening and typically requires a response to the person communicating with you in a quantifiable format by validating what is being said. So if someone says to me, Tom, we really appreciate the way you're working around here, I said, Mike, I appreciate that. Is there one thing that I do that you feel best about? That would be think listening. That's at a level where I'm quantifying. Or they say, you know, you really could improve on the way that you time frame your projects. And I say, well, I really appreciate that. Could you help me with a project that would be a good example of where I can improve on? That would be at think listening level. So you will tend to find that the process requires response when you think listening. And that's critical. If somebody says there's 10 things we need to get done in relationship to this project, and based upon me knowing how to prioritize my time, then the think listening level would require me to actually go through with them prioritizing that list. That's a think listening level. The problem we have in communication is, as it states in your study guide, is we have ambiguous and we have specific. Ambiguous is mostly what we say. You know, if I say you're doing a great job, that's not specific. Because you're not sure what about the job. Or I say, boy, you sure could improve in the way you relate to a customer or a client. Truly, that's ambiguous in nature. Or I need it real soon, or can you get this done this week? Or I need that fairly, are you familiar with some of these? I need that fairly quickly. Now the problem is, at the end of all these hangs a criticism or a negative statement, which means fairly quickly. What does that mean? And if I can't get it done fairly quickly because I don't know what fairly quickly means, then I superimpose fairly quickly on it, and I'm probably not fairly quickly, because I've got 15 other fairly quickly things I need to do. So we end up in criticism because we were an ineffective listener, not because necessarily we weren't trying to listen in the process or maintaining eye contact in the process. That's pretty good. I need it real soon. I love this one. I need it as soon as possible, which was an old ASAP military term. None of us are quite sure what it meant, but it meant as soon as I can do, as soon as I did from what I did before, but I've got 5 things I need to do, all given to me by the same person, all given to me in as soon as possible. So which is as soon as possible, right? The whole idea behind getting these ambiguous is for the listener to make them specific. So the challenge is when somebody says, I need it fairly quickly, and you're a great listener, you're a think listener type person, you would validate in a non-intimidating environment or response what that really means so you know the time frame. Now, oftentimes you're going to find, though, that the person said fairly quickly didn't know what it was defined as. So they have not defined that terminology. So there might be a little bit of consternation initially in the communication. But if you're willing to process this as a team player, you can change the total environment around your commitment level and cooperation. In probing for real meaning on page number 2 in the workbook, there's really 3 things you need to do in the think listening level. Number 1 is ask verification questions. Ask verification questions. For example, somebody says fairly quickly, I say, Mike, does that mean tomorrow morning or afternoon? And he might say, no, it means this afternoon. But you see what I did? I verified the time frame by taking a risk. And think listeners sometimes will take a risk, depending upon where in the organization you tend to operate or function. Number 2 is conclusion questions. A conclusion question is different. I just said tomorrow morning or tomorrow afternoon. Conclusion question would be related to more like, then I'll have it done by 5 tomorrow. Is that acceptable with you? That would be a conclusion rather than, as we sometimes know in communication, an alternate choice. When I said tomorrow morning or tomorrow afternoon, that was more an alternate choice. Verification, conclusion says, then I'll get it to you by 5 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. Is that acceptable? Okay? Somebody might say, I sure appreciate the way you approached that customer yesterday. And I said, well, Mike, I really appreciate the feedback. What you're sharing with me, though, is you like the way that I handled the negative response, was able to give them a couple of choices on how we could solve the problem, and then kept them as a customer. Is that what you're telling me? That is verification. Okay? Now, you might not do it with that same words, but hopefully we eventually all get the idea that it's not good enough to tell some kid they're good in school. I mean, we have a daughter that's 12 years old, comes home, and does her homework right away when she gets home from school. Now, I like that. Not whether she gets good grades or not, okay? I like the fact she knows how to process. And if she knows how to process, she'll probably always be a learning person because she knows what it takes to block her time, as we've talked about in a previous message. Now, I could say, Ginny, boy, you're a great student. I really appreciate you. You're getting great grades, and Daddy likes that, and that's great. Well, what does that do for Virginia? You see, I have enforced the results and not the process. I have made an ambiguous statement, not a specific statement. So if I say, Ginny, the one thing I appreciate about you in terms of your relationship with school is you come home every night and you get to your books. Now I've reinforced the action. That's specific. That's specific. And that's what we're talking about here. So it's ask verification questions, ask conclusion questions, or just rephrase by saying, in other words, what you're telling me is a rephrased statement. Okay? They say, well, can you get it done this week? I say, in other words, if I could get it done by Thursday, that would be acceptable to you in terms of my time frame. They say, no, I really like it done on Wednesday. I say, what time on Wednesday would you need it then? Then I move from rephrase to, that's right, to verification or conclusion, depending upon how you phrase it. Now you say, Tom, you're moving a little fast for me. Yes, I am. But you'll learn to process this. But it clears up a lot of problems in the environment. Rules to team by today are, listen to the meaning and not just the words. Listen to the meaning and not just the words. In other words, think, listen. Oftentimes we get captured in the way people say things rather than the things people mean. I'll take you to a personal experience. My wife says to me, boy, I disagree with that and that's off the wall and I remember what happened between us 15 years ago. Now, I'm hopefully not being too vulnerable here because hopefully everybody has this kind of experience, and if you don't, I'd worry about your relationships. Because a dialogue like this is nothing more than an opportunity for people to get closer together, right? Right. Thank you. Now, you can't say that to them by saying, gee, I'm sure glad we get a chance to argue because it is a way for us to get closer together. But the whole point here is if I'm listening to her, there's probably a desire to get a little more what? Attention in the process. You see what I'm saying? I mean, if a kid is always complaining and causing problems in school, it probably isn't the problems that's the issue. It's what? If you really think listening, it's probably the fact they want a little more attention, or they need to feel a little more important in the process, so they tend to do or say things that tend to be out of line because they found that's what gets reactions from us, right? And that's typical in communication. Number 2 is don't interrupt when the person is sharing. Don't interrupt when the person is sharing. You know, a customer says, I've had a bad experience in here. I say, look, don't tell me, talk to the boss. I don't deal with things like this. You know, well, where's the boss? Well, he's not here. He's somewhere else. Well, what you did is you leaped in the sharing mode only to cause a higher level of anxiety upon the part of the person sharing because you interrupted the communication. Number 3 is to suspend your prejudgments. A prejudgment is something that relates to your feelings about the person rather than response to the communication. So, for example, if you and I were talking, you said, boy, I hate that tie. But you thought about that. That would be a prejudgment that would tend to get in the way of the communication. Or you would say, you know, he's always complaining about this. You know, that would be a prejudgment. Now, the problem with that is when you're involved in prejudgment, you're not doing what? You're not listening, that's right. You're not thinking about what questions you could ask that would get you to a better understanding level in the midst of the communication. Number 4, be very conscious about what your actions are saying. You know, research says, Stanford, 7% is verbal, okay? 38% is vocal, that's the way we say things, the inflection we give, and 55% is visual. So I'll give you an example. You're telling me how bad you feel, and I'm standing going like this. Now, what am I telling you? Do I care? Do I hope it happens to you again? Maybe. You know, we usually say people relate to negative things 2 ways. They either are glad it happened to you, or they hope it happens to you again because they don't want it to happen to them. But this is a verbalization. And I can say, boy, you know, I'm real happy that happened to you. You know, now what I've done is I've taken the 7% verbal and confused it with the 38% vocal, which is inflection, and the 55% visual, which is body language. You know, or somebody says, boy, I'm real excited about this new idea we got here. Okay? I think this is really going to set us on fire. You know, we're moving forward. Now, now, you've met people like that, and interestingly enough, about 3% of the population are actually excited when they say that way. So you have to be very careful about prejudging the fact that, boy, they're not saying much. And number 5 is finally, be sure that you can fulfill the agreement, because in most communications, there's an agreement, irrespective of whether you think there is or not. You know, if somebody compliments you, the agreement is, boy, I'll do it again. Now, you might not say it that way, you know, but you might say something like, you know, and Mike, I appreciate you noticing that because my commitment is to be able to do that every time I have a customer like that. That's agreement, and that's the 5th level. So there's really so many things to look at in terms of listening. But the challenge truly is defensive listening. Be able to ask the questions, verify where they're coming from, and be able to do it in a work-together, co-worker environment. Because oftentimes, when somebody's sharing with you an opinion, and you bring a question to the sharing, you can tend to raise the anxiety a little bit. So you've got to be very careful in a defensive listening posture that you're giving them an open, not only vocalization of the inflection, but a verbal view of how you feel about what they're sharing with you about. And truly, that's called the approach to effective listening. Thank you very much. Thank you.